career was also spent. It's all right. Was also spent working in the pretty much solely with community banks and credit unions, building all different types of financial models and doing M&A work and strategic planning. And I am a Wake Forest University graduate, so go Deeks.
All right, thanks, Steve. Sorry about that. Sorry today. There's always some technical glitch I have, folks. I paused the recording because I was a little late starting the webinar, so I thank you for toiling here through with this with me. Okay, so why are we here today? As we've discussed, Cecil's obviously been a big topic for all of us as we continue to think about it and talk to our credit unions who are utilizing our solution. It just became more apparent as we went through this year that we thought it would be helpful to not only try to, talk about a topic or talk about this topic every month, but potentially to share what our users were experiencing, concerns they had, questions we were hearing from other users, and just be able to have a way to kind of better memorialize that or circulate that information to all of our users rather than just on a one-off basis. So the inspiration for the coffee talk was, hey, let's just tackle these topics every month. We'll get some feedback. It will allow our users to ask questions. It'll allow prospects who have not worked with us yet to ask questions. And so we've really tried to think about this. And so we thought with January, we'd take a step back because we recognize that while many have already made the leap into Cecil, there may be a number of credit unions who are just starting the process now. And so we thought we would take this month to kind of reintroduce the Cecil solver. We'll certainly have a couple of other topics we'll discuss. We'll take any questions you have. And again, just reinforce the notion that when you subscribe with us at Quick Rate for the Cecil solver, we're going to be here to support you. And so this is just one way we think we can effectively demonstrate that. So this is a little bit of a newer format for most of you who've attended a Quick Rate webinar in the past. You're in presentation mode, which currently means you can hopefully hear me and Steve, but we can't hear you. But if you want to participate, there's 3 different ways you can jump into the fray today. One, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. I would say the most popular ways are just to submit a question in the Q&A box, which we already have one, and then also utilize the chat feature, which we will continue to monitor throughout the discussion today and take those and interject those as appropriate. So we'll do that. I'll make sure this is just not a question about being able to hear something. All right, so this is a question that's coming. We'll take this one here in a little bit. But yeah, please submit those throughout the presentation today, and we will address all of these before the end of today's discussion. Just kind of redocumenting why are we here. Again, we just wanted to make sure we're providing a forum to give you to ask any questions, but also allow us to share what we are hearing, not only from the industry, but also from our users. In addition, as we continue to get feedback and we try to make enhancements to our Cecil solution, we want to do that. Steve and I have a call next week with Allison Clark from the Ncua. We want to get her feedback on what she's seeing, hearing. But again, if we get feedback from that conversation, then we're certainly going to make enhancements. So again, this is we feel like we've built a wonderful solution, but we also recognize that this, as we move through this year, there's, we're going to come into more information. And if we think there's better ways or things we can do to improve our tool, we're going to do that. And this will be another way that we can share those enhancements with you. We also expect to bring in other experts, auditors, other industry experts around Cecil, so that you don't have to hear us all year, but that we can also bring together people who we've been working with our Cecil tool and have them share their thoughts and expertise with you as well. So we're really excited about the coffee talk. We're excited you're here today, and we're going to move forward. But again, mark your calendars every month. We're gonna be here to again make this process and this transition as seamless as possible for you. Okay, so at this point, as I mentioned, we've done a couple of these already. We thought it would be, helpful to start here in January, that we'd have potentially a number of credit unions who've not done much work on Cecil yet. So we thought we'd just give a quick overview of the Cecil Solver tool. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So this is a sort of a screenshot of what the summary page from our Cecil Solver tool looks like. One of the first things that you'll notice when you pull up the Cecil Solver, or the first time you log in to use it, or if you do a walkthrough with us, is that we're able to very heavily utilize all of the public data that's out there, right? Everyone has to file those Form 5300 call reports every single quarter, going back to the beginning of time. And so when you first log into the tool, you can see all of your historical loss and balance data already presented by segment, using the segmentation that's available on the 5300s. And little foreshadowing, we're certainly going to talk, or can talk, about the differences or the changes, the significant changes to the call reports that are coming as of March 31st, and how we're going to tackle that when that happens. But not only does the tool give you access to all of this historical data on your institution, but also on all of your peers as well, which is critical because of qualitative factor adjustments and guidance, and that we want to give to you on those external or environmental Q factors. And we think, utilizing peer data, especially for segments of the portfolio where your historical loss data is thin or negligible, which is very common, especially in things like mortgage loans over the last few years. But looking at that data thickens the sample size and allows us to intelligently give you an idea of what losses might be like outside your four walls and the environment around you. But one of the big input for our tool for using the weighted average remaining maturity, or the WARM method, certainly one of the more straightforward approaches available to credit unions for complying with Cecil, is calculating the weighted average remaining maturity. And that's really not something specific to this methodology. You can't really utilize any methodology for Cecil without doing some average remaining life calculations on throughout the portfolio, because of the basic, concept that Cecil is all about this life of the loan concept, right? Looking at estimating losses over the remaining life of the asset. So we have to get a feel for what those remaining lives are in different segments of the portfolio. But we certainly can help you do that with those WARM calculations, or even do them for you if need be. And once we plug that input into the tool, one of the big features of the tool is that everything always recalculates instantaneously on the fly. So as you change any input or any assumption anywhere in the tool, everything recalculates. So you can always see exactly what impact those changes are going to have. So if you change your WARM, if you tweak a Q factor, if you add some individually assessed loans into the mix, you can see exactly how much that's going to impact your Cecil reserve by segment and for the whole portfolio, and kind of immediately recompare your surplus or shortfall as you tweak assumptions and inputs. And I think that really helps in not only honing in on different building different scenarios in a time effective manner, but also getting a feel for where you need to spend your time. We don't want you wasting or spending any more time on Cecil than you have to. So if there's areas of the portfolio where you're struggling with a specific input or a specific assumption, you can try changing that assumption. And if the recalculated Cecil reserve is almost exactly the same, then that assumption really isn't, doesn't have much impact on the overall calculation. And you probably should therefore probably spend a little bit less time on it. But as we plug in all that data, all the historical data recalculates, and then we allow you a lot more flexibility now in the qualitative factors than we did in the initial version of the tool. So a recent enhancement is the Q factors tab now allowed you to add and sort of use a build-up method to add individual qualitative factor adjustments, both internal adjustments and environmental or external Q factor adjustments. I see there's already a question related to that that's come in, and we'll tackle that in just a second, I promise. And once we work on our Q factors, we have an expected future loss rate for each segment of the portfolio, and then we can apply that to your portfolio, your total portfolio balance. We can pull out any that need to be individually assessed, which we can also talk about in a minute, and then we can calculate Cecil on a segment by segment basis, and then for the whole portfolio. Our tool also tackles the unfunded commitments piece of Cecil, which is it's not completely new for commercial banks. It's pretty new for most credit unions because it's not even a line item on your call reports right now. It will be starting at the end of next year. There will be a new line item on your call reports right under the new ACL, or allowance for credit losses for loans. There'll be a new line item asking you to calculate an ACL specifically for unfunded commitments separately. So while it's not a large piece of the puzzle from a dollar perspective for most credit unions, it's almost a rounding error for a lot. It's going to be a line item on the call report. So you will need a justification for how you, a methodology for calculating it. So that's a piece of the puzzle as well. And you'll see we also have a tab there for the individually assessed loans. So any of those individual loans that have are significantly problematic, that may be close to default, and you don't feel like you can pool them with anyone else, and you need to manage them individually, we have a worksheet and a template for calling them from the herd, so to speak, and manage them individually. Sean, can you flip to that second slide? Just from a tool management perspective, once you're done plugging everything in, you can save all your inputs as scenarios. They get saved securely on our system. You can access the scenarios whenever you want, build as many scenarios as you want, no limitations there. You can run the tool as often as you need to. You can update data on an intra-quarterly. So if you don't want to, do it as of the end of last quarter, if you want to do it as of January or February, you can override the current balances to be as of any date you want, so that the tool's not limited to running, just on a quarterly basis or anything. You can make notes at the segment level as you work through the tool, which is a great way, a great tool, pun intended, for managing the tool and sharing it with your examiners and your auditors, right? On an ongoing basis, after they're comfortable with your methodology, the process is going to be, walking them through your justifications for things like Q factor adjustments and unfunded commitments and whatnot at the segment level. So having your thoughts organized as to why you made certain assumptions, or how you did certain calculations, and attaching those notes throughout the tool to the correct segment, it just keeps everything really well organized. And so we allow you to do that as well. And certainly when you're done working with a scenario, you can export it. You can get a PDF export, you can get an Excel export of the entire tool. So any way that you want to get the data or the output, you can get it. Sean?
Okay, thank you, Steve. We already have a number of questions. Let's just jump in and take a few of these now.
Sure.
So let's start with the first one. Obviously, Cecil's warm method requires some degree of management input and such for your model. Do you folks have a questionnaire in the works to help a manager make an educated way to quantify Qfec? So here's what I will say, and I'll let Steve answer after this. So yes, we don't have necessarily a questionnaire, but we do, have the criteria that certainly institutions have used around that, which we can certainly provide, and we can also share anecdotally, what other institutions are doing to address the Q factors. The Q factors, again, I think is one of those things. It's beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? I think it's unique to your institution, so we can give you certainly things to think about. We can provide you with some economic data points, but at the end of the day, I always feel like this comes back to what do you think is going to impact your portfolio in the future, and identifying those and just being directionally accurate with those on a go-forward basis is really the best way to tackle the Q factors, in addition to all the peer data that Steve has mentioned that our tool provides. So again, we can talk specifically about that with you. And again, I wouldn't necessarily characterize as a questionnaire, but we can certainly provide you with information around it. Steve?
Yeah, I think it's more of a conversation between us and you, and on a one-off basis, to try to understand where the sensitivities of a tool are and how to best quantify your qualitative factors. From a, from an internal Q factor standpoint, and this is something Sean's gonna expound upon in a few minutes. It doesn't necessarily have to be very different from what you've been doing in the past, right? We've always been looking at non-public information like our risk grades and how they're changing over time from an internal data perspective, in order to get a feel for directionally, where losses are headed in the future versus where they've been in the past. And a lot of that part of your process at looking at your own internal data to quantify some Q factors can continue pretty much unabated under Cecil. What's going to be a little different is all this new great peer data that we have to give you to help you quantify those external or environmental Q factors. And it's like everything else, it seems, in Cecil, it's subjective, right? There's no less subjectivity under Cecil, probably more subjectivity in Cecil than in the incurred loss methodology. So it's all really, what it's about is making reasonable assumptions and being able to justify those assumptions. If your losses are negligible and your peers are at 1%, what do I do a Q factor of 10 basis points, 50 basis points, or 100 basis points? We can certainly give a second set of eyes as to what we think sounds reasonable to us, and present the data to you and help you kind of get to where you need to be. But there's no kind of, we tried very hard in the past to have more formalized universal documents, and we found that they always need to be tweaked for everyone's situation. So I think it's easier to just kind of honestly talk it through while looking at your data, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Steve. All right, the next question is, what's the open pool method and how many credit unions use this versus the warm method? So I'll let Steve answer this. It's a more technical question. I don't know how many credit unions are using that versus the warm method. Again, I can say that the warm methodology is clearly one of the most popular selected. But Steve, if you want to talk the distinctions between open pool.
Yeah, so there's two. That's a great question, because there's elements of the snapshot open pool method that we actually utilize in our tool here. I think the general biggest difference is, the warm method is the only one that was designed specifically from its inception to be a portfolio-based solution where you're not getting individual loan data for every single loan that's ever been on your books and have to have 50 data points for each loan going back to the beginning of time. And a lot of those complex methodologies, Snapshot Open Pool was originally designed as one of those. The warm method was kind of specifically presented as an alternative where if you don't have that data, or you're not an overly large complex institution and don't need to use all that loan level data, you can do a portfolio based approach. And the best example of that is the warm method. However, for example, to give you a good example, a lot of times the warm method does do annual calculations and then multiply those annual estimates by the life of the loan. So whereas the snapshot open pool tends to look at aggregate losses and then not have to multiply aggregate losses over a period of time. So you're doing kind of a multi-year net charge-off ratio. Whereas the warm method typically starts with an annual net charge-off, an average annual net charge-off that they multiply by how many years. It's kind of a technical difference. We've always liked the aggregate look because we think conceptually it's a little bit more straightforward. So that's one element of the snapshot open pool that we integrate into our what is mostly the warm method. That's why right on the top there it says that our tool is a combination of the warm and open pool snapshot methodologies. If anyone was curious as to how we integrate those tools, it's certainly a warm portfolio-based approach with some elements of open pool, like the aggregate charge-offs as opposed to annual averages that you have to then multiply. Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Steve. If not, we can certainly circle back to it, but I think
sure.
That was good. All right, so the next question is, how do most calculate the warm? If using your Excel tool, is there a way to export the loan level data into the spreadsheet? So the answer there is yes. So again, this comes down to your institution and your data. Your core system may already provide you with access to getting a warm report. If it does not, and as our tool provides, to calculate the warm, we just need a few fields of data. And in our previous discussions, we knew this question would come up because we didn't have the warm discussion today, but Melanie from our team has walked everyone through it. So we have a nice little worksheet that, this is more of a, closer to a guide of how to get the data. So we need a few different fields. If you can export those to us, you can export them into our spreadsheet and calculate the warms yourself, or you can send them to us and we will do it for you. But either way, we can assist with calculating that warm for you if it's not something you choose to do. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, the warm can be really easy or really, I don't want to say hard, really quick or really slow, depending upon your data, right? If you have a lot of different types of, participation loans or farmed out mortgage loans or whatnot that aren't in your core system, that aren't on your Aries file, and you have to deal with different systems to get those all in an Excel-based format, that obviously takes time, right? But if most of your data is sitting right there in the Aries file, we don't need a lot of data. I mean, your warm is pretty much balance and maturity date. So for most categories of loans, that's pretty straightforward. Obviously, credit card loans can be a little bit different. They don't have a stated maturity date, so we work around that. So we can show you how to take your Aries file and sort of cut and paste literally the loan level data directly into a template to calculate the warm by segment, or we can do that for you if it's not something you have the resources to do or don't feel like doing. So lots of ways to tackle it. Really depends upon how good your data or how clean, how exportable your data is into an Excel environment, because that's the easiest way to do it. Certainly some ALMs or cores can provide that for you, but we don't hold our breath for that, because I'd say probably less than half the time, those core systems or ALMs are going to have good warm data at the call report segment level. I think more of them are starting to, because they're also getting bombarded with requests for this type of data where they haven't in the past. So I think we're going to hopefully see a little wholesale shift from a provider standpoint and giving you guys some more support in doing that.
Thanks, Steve. And again, I just to kind of bookend then what Steve said, I think our important point here is we want to make whatever's easiest for you to do. If you have easy access to the Aries file, perfect. If you don't, then, as Steve mentioned, we just need a few fields, but that's where you can talk with David and Jason, and then he'll get Melanie and our team involved. And again, we can take that burden off you. Our goal is just, again, to eliminate pain points. And if that's a pain point for you, there's multiple ways we can help you tackle it, either by assisting you to do it or doing it on your behalf. So just let us know if we want to have a discussion around that. Once live, how often is the reserve calculated? Do most do quarterly? I would say yes. The majority are doing quarterly. Some larger institutions may be doing this monthly, but the majority of institutions are going to be doing this quarterly. And going back to the warm calculation, just as a separate point, how many times do you need to calculate that, right? Some want to calculate it every quarter when they're doing the reserve. The fact and practical matter is your warms probably will not move much quarter to quarter. So we can certainly calculate them, and you can certainly calculate them quarterly, but we do have institutions who are only going to do it semi-annually. We have even some institutions who are only going to do it once a year, just because the warms, once you start doing it, you'll see they don't tend to change dramatically unless you have a huge shift or growth or contraction in your loan portfolio. So again, quarterly I would say is the standard. Steve, anything there you want to add?
Yeah, it's going to be a trial and error process, right? With our because we're not doing this for ourselves, not only for ourselves. So when you're talking with your examiners, they may have depending on what side of the bed they got up on, they might have a feeling that you need to calculate the warm more frequently. And then you certainly have to. But I wouldn't start with calculating it as frequently as, the more you do it, the more time and energy is going to be involved. So I don't want you guys wasting time where it's not necessary and where nobody's going to care, including your examiners, right? One thing about Cecil is if we're doing Cecil correctly, if the standard does what it's supposed to do, then there should be smaller incremental changes in our reserves over time, right? The whole idea is we're trying to smooth this cyclical trend of a credit cycle coming and everyone being behind the curve and provisioning like crazy halfway through the cycle, and then reserves continuing to increase after the entire credit cycle is over. They want to shift that earlier on in the process. So if Cecil does what it's supposed to on a quarterly, on a monthly basis, your reserves should be more consistent, should have less change in them, because we're taking a longer term approach and we're estimating losses not just over a year or annualized period, but over a multi-year period. So trending towards a little bit less often, because you're going to see less change with the warm and with Cecil, with the reserve in general.
All right, thanks, Steve. I'm going to take this last question that came in. Since Fieldstone Credit Union is just a few miles away from Sean, if we signed up and have any problems, will Sean be there within minutes to help? Just kidding. Mark, hello. Thanks for joining. I will be there if you need me. So just if necessary, I will be over there. Thank you for.
He likes his coffee black with 2 sugars, though, in case anyone was curious.
Exactly. All right. Is the warm calculated in the model? So again, this is something that is the one piece of data we do rely on your information for. So we will need to get it from you one way or another. So either if you're doing it, you'll have to calculate it, or again, we give you the ability to send us your data and we will calculate it on your behalf. And then those numbers that are generated, we put into the tool, and that really starts the process. Steve, anything there to add?
Yeah, it's the one piece of the puzzle here, data-wise, that we simply can't get directly from the call reports, right? Nowhere does it ask you to on the call reports to do any average remaining life or average remaining maturity calculation. So we have to. That's the one part where we have to get some data and work with you guys on the front end. Certainly, over time, we've considered, gathering all the data that we get from all of our 100+ users over time, and maybe at some point creating some blind pools where we can do some estimates of, people say, are there industry standards? Like if we don't have time to calculate the warm right now and we want to see, have a general spitball idea of what our reserve is going to be, can we plug in some warms that are industry standard? What's the average, warm for a credit card loan or for a used vehicle loan? There is not a lot of good data out there in the ether for that yet, but I think we'll build enough data so that at some point we can give some decent default values there over time that then you can modify with your own data. But until there's a better sample size out there in the universe of that kind of data being calculated, which hasn't really been done until now, then we do rely on you guys calculating that or us doing it for you on the front end.
Great, thanks, Steve. The next question is, must the Cecil Solver program loan categories coincide with the categories used by the call report? What if we wish to fine tune the categories for the breakdowns, and how does that affect the data used for us in Pure Data? So again, I'll let Steve chime in. He'll be the better answerer for this, but just the point is the call report categories, we use those because that gives us good historical information, right? So we do give you the ability to fine tune that, but that was where we started in order to give you good, consistent loan history for those pools, which is one of the things Cecil really wanted you to do. Steve, you want to take it from there?
Yeah. So towards the second part of the question, you can certainly add custom risk pools, custom loan segments if you want. Obviously, the limitation there is the more that you do custom segmentation, the less apples to apples the data is going to become. We won't have that historical data to calculate your loss rates in the past on that custom segment, because by definition we've diverged from the realm of what's available on the call reports. We can help you calculate it. We can show you how to calculate it. So it's not a huge issue, but we can't just present it for you. Same thing with the peer data, right? The more custom segments you add, the peer data is not going to be perfectly comparable, right? You can utilize peer data from the parent pool, from the larger call report segment, as your closest guide to what your custom segment would be, but we're not going to have any peer data on boat loans, for example. If you pull your boat loans or RV loans out of your all other bucket and you want to do them separately, you can certainly do that. But the peer data that you're going to use, the best is going to simply be your either vehicle or all other loans as your guidepost. And that speaks to, I think, a larger important point as to how much segmentation do we need, right? When do I have to have all these, a bunch of additional beyond the call report level of segmentation? And there's no hard and fast rule for that, like a lot of stuff in under the Cecil standard. If you feel that your boat loans, for example, represent a completely different risk pool than the rest of the vehicle loans or all other loans, that's when we think we might have to do it. But we don't want to segment just for segment's sake, right? It's not, more is not always better. As Sean would always say, don't confuse precision for accuracy, right? If you've got a bunch of participation loans, as is common with credit unions, in your new vehicle portfolio, do you have to have your participation new vehicles as a separate segment from your home originated new vehicle loans? Well, if they perform similar in the past and you have no very specific reason to expect that the participation vehicle loans would perform very different in the future than the rest of yours, then no, by definition, you don't have to have two different segments. You would necessarily want to pool them together because they have similar risk characteristics. And the more that we can pool together, the less segments that we have that have similar risk characteristics, the better our data becomes, because it's all about sample size here, right? If you there is real risk. Honestly, there is very real risk in over segmentation, because the more you segment, the smaller your bucket becomes, the less loans are in each of your buckets. And with Cecil, we're trying to look at your long-term historical performance and use that data to extrapolate trends into the future. The smaller your sample size in each bucket becomes, the less helpful those historical trends become, right? And so if you do too much segmentation, you're going to have to rely even more on external data, because your internal data will be so thin or almost negligible. But once you've done all that additional segmentation, the external data is not going to be very helpful either. So it's a double-edged sword there, because right when you need the most external data, you won't have any peer data on boat loans or RV loans because it's not in the public sphere. So we need to balance segmentation with availability of good, thick data over time. And so you have to straddle that fence a little bit. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I would just add, I think Steve kind of touched on it. I would segment more if it's opportunistic for you, right? If there's an advantage for you to tell your story, then consider it. But until that point, or if you needed to defend something, but other than that, I think, again, probably the historical pools are probably the place to start. But again, if opportunistically, then maybe you consider it. So, okay, does the FRED info contain forward-looking forecasts, or is it just historical data? It is just historical data. We will be adding additional data points to it, but again, forecasting is a big rabbit hole, right? And so we want to give you context. We want to be able to illustrate if there are any correlations to losses, but I just be careful. No, even the best. I mean, take Netflix yesterday, right? Just to change topics. You have analysts covering these companies, and they missed on the new subscriber growth by a factor of over 100%, right? Forecasting is a dangerous business, and I just don't think most people just don't do it well. And I think the regulators recognize that most of us just shouldn't spend a whole lot of time trying to forecast. I think ultimately, again, what Q factors and economic forecasts come down to, what will impact my portfolio the most, right? Current conditions, and then what possibly could impact us in the future. A lot of times credit unions are associated with a factory, right? Or some group, right? Those are the things that are going to drive probably your performance. And things happening in your local area more than a broad, general economic forecast.
But we know that you can't get, we know that a lot of times you can't get through an audit or an exam without being able to, honestly say that you've taken into account economic trends. So while we provide some FRED economic trends for sure, and there are some data trends in FRED, not on our tool yet, but in the universe of FRED data that do have short-term projections in them. And we're looking at ways to try to help present some of that, but you really have to, the question becomes, does it have any predictive value, right? Even historical correlations, and I use this example all the time, if you were to look at mortgage losses, your mortgage losses or your peers' mortgage losses, and compare them to unemployment in your state during the last credit cycle, you would have guaranteed seen a huge positive correlation. 2009, 10, 11, your statewide unemployment rate, no matter what state you're in, went way up and then came down in 2012, 13. Your peers' mortgage losses, I guaranteed, did the same exact thing. Why? That credit cycle was literally driven by a collapse of the housing market. So it makes sense. Then you say, all right, we've got a correlation. So next time this happens, the unemployment, I have to expect my mortgage losses are going to do this. So I'm going to jack up my reserves. Well, let's put that into practice. What happened last year, 2020, 2021? This is what happened to everyone's unemployment. Did that happen to anyone's mortgage losses? No, it certainly did not. So even strong historical correlation between loss trends and economic data does not suggest, at least not in this situation, that that's what's going to happen next time. So it didn't have any useful predictive value, even though it had historical correlation. So I take the economic data with a huge grain of salt, but we're aware that they want you to look at it. So we present some there to look at. We think looking at the peer trends and then thinking about more local things like, are you attached to a factory? Are you right next to a lake where if it dries up, your boat loans are all going to fall apart? Those are the more very local driven things. And that economic data is, is not necessarily very easily available to us. So it's going to be on a one-off, a very individual basis.
Well said, Steve. Thank you. Do some cores or ALM systems calculate internal historical prepayments? How do credit unions estimate prepayments? For mortgage loans, is there any assistance with comparing MBS pools to get prepayments? So again, I'll just take this real quick. Certainly some do. There's different runs you could get from your core systems that would show payoff activity where you could do prepayments. Mortgage loans, obviously, there's standard industry standards, that we can all access to. Again, the simple kind of give and take with prepayments is right. The higher the prepayments, the lower your WARM's going to be, right? So I think it's that fundamental relationship we're really trying to get at. And again, I think we'll see more. Our tool does give you the ability to put in a number. If you wanted to go into something more in depth, again, I would caution you to say, what is the real value of doing that extra time and energy, maybe an expense to calculate it? Is it really going to change your analysis? If you think it is, then there's probably something to talk about. But if there's not, I think using some general assumptions around prepayments is probably more than adequate. Steve?
Yeah, I would echo that. For most segments of your portfolio, there is not going to be any good industry data on prepayments. Sometimes your ALMs or core can help you do some prepayment studies or have a report that you can run that does that. But just like with the WARMs, we don't hold our breath that they're going to be helpful there. But mortgages are one area where, yeah, there is some industry data on prepayments. Certainly the entire mortgage-backed securities industry relies on that. So if you wanted to look at some of that data, like the Public Securities Association, those PSA kind of standards, or the single SMM calculations for mortgages where you can get conditional prepayment rate estimates for the whole industry, you can start there. But it's going to be highly sensitive to the environment we're in right now, right? If you look at a lot of those calculations and standards, if you're reading a study that was done 10 years ago or 8 years ago, how relevant is that to the mortgage market today or over the next couple of years going forward? So you might have a ton of data and it might be really good studies. And if it's 4 years old, it's not going to help in your estimation. Looking at your data right now is going to be a better guide. But conservative prepayment rates on things like mortgages are in like the 5 to 10% range, and more aggressive are in the 15 to 20% range annual. I mean, just intuitively we know that if the average life of a 30-year mortgage is something like is between 5 and 10 years before it gets prepaid in one way or another. So prepayment rates are significant in large segments of the portfolio, and they do have a significant impact on your WARMs and your reserves. So there's something that not to be overlooked. But since there's not a lot of great data out there, just make reasonable assumptions and find and have a justification for them. And if you get feedback from your examiner that needs to be improved, then that's when we can work on doing that.
Yeah, and then again, just to kind of echo and just maybe make one point, right? Again, even with mortgages, right? So 7 years is usually typically been the standard, but think about where we are in the interest rate cycle right now. Last year, in the last couple of years, as rates were coming down, we all saw, a lot of refinancings. Now at the trough where interest rates might back up, that data is not going to probably be as relevant this year, right? We'll probably see fewer refinancings because rates are more likely to tend higher. So again, you just always have to be careful about trying to, as Steve said, I always like to say, trying to be too precise, right? Just try to be directionally accurate, right? Because you can go down rabbit holes and do a whole lot of work and not really give yourself any extra value other than having spent a lot of time and energy. So just
if you have 15 subjective factors you went into that one rate versus 2 subjective factors, did those additional 13 ones that you spent a lot of time on really improve the likelihood that your value is accurate, right? So we can start that rabbit hole right now. I mean, Sean, you mentioned, well, prepayments you think would be less in an increasing interest rate environment, but that also interplays with pricing. Real estate prices are exploding. So lots of people are trying to buy houses now before they become unaffordable. And to do that, they have to sell old houses and get new mortgages. So there's lots of factors that go into prepayments. It's not the interest rate environment, sure, but also the market for sales of new homes and logistics and everything else. So there's a lot that certainly goes into it. It's a multivariate, analysis.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So again, talking timeline. So we decided here in January, again, we did talk about, the warm and calculate it in some of our previous coffee talks, but starting here in January, it's probably my fault. I sensed the fact that maybe, hey, we may have a number of credit unions on here today who just really are starting the process. And so some of the things that maybe we have covered in previous ones, we should really just take a step back as the year starts. And let's just talk about what we need to get done here in calendar year 2022. Obviously, 1, we have to select a methodology. 2, we want to try to identify that data that we're going to need, which are some of the great questions that all of you offered this morning around your core system and getting that data and the good historical losses that we provide you in our tool with the call report. So we do some of this work for you with our tool. We've talked about Q factors. Again, the processes you have built. This is good information that you want to continue to incorporate and then enhance with the peer data that our Cecil solution provides. The weighted average remaining maturity. Again, this is something that we rely upon you to provide to our tool. We can assist you with calculating it. But again, these are some of the things you're going to want to make sure you're thinking about. As we move forward through the year, you're going to obviously want to run these calculations and test them. Our suggestion is certainly we'd love to review those with you. You can compare it to what you're currently doing and run them parallel. Whether you do that 1, 2, 3, or 4 times this year, that's completely up to you. But at some point, you probably need to make sure you're doing it. And then in order to be prepared that if there is going to be a sizable, change to your reserve because of Cecil, you're going to want to make sure you give your board ample time to consider that and how you would, deal with that issue. So for a number of reasons, these are really the bullet points that we want to tackle this year. Again, we can assist you with them, but our tool gets you that running head start of providing and aggregating a lot of that data. And then the other final piece of data, the warm, we can assist you with. Steve, anything you want to add here?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
Okay, good. All right. So, when do we need to have this, solution in place, right? I mean, certainly if your examiners are coming in this year, regulators, you're going to want to make sure you've made a decision and have some discussions around it. Adopting early, we've talked about this. Do you have a reason to? Most credit unions do not. If you're larger, you might have, but most of them, this is kind of a one-off area that you might have a reason to adopt early. Again, I think most of us are probably preparing for end of, for the first quarter of next year to get this done. Calculating the warms, how often do you need to do it? So, many of you will probably run this analysis on a quarterly basis. And so you may want to run your warm every quarter. What I think a lot of you will find is your warms do not change dramatically from quarter to quarter. So we certainly have institutions who intend on running this only semi-annually or even in some cases annually. Again, it's going to depend on A, your comfort level, and B, after you've run it a few times and you see it, maybe it doesn't change much. Maybe that alters your philosophy there. But if we're preparing your warm information for you, we are prepared to run it as often as you would like. So again, that's just a form and feel for your institution. How often do I need to run Cecil? Again, I think much like for many of you, your current incurred loss methodology, this is something you're doing quarterly. Again, I think that's probably advisable for you as well. Finally, creating multiple scenarios as of the same dates. One of the advantages of that, we provide you by having all your historical call report information available to you is you can, once you've identified those worms, you can look back at that increment over different periods of time going back, historically. And what that can give you is some insight and some context on, okay, even though we've been in a benign credit environment right now, what have I seen in the past, right? It's almost like doing a little bit of the stress testing where you can kind of say, okay, if I had a 4-year warm, what were the worst 4 years that I've experienced at the credit union? And you can decide, is this something that's, potentially, could reintroduce itself? Or have we made changes, or were there special circumstances that, contributed to those historical losses? But the most important thing is it gives you context, all right? It gives you more information to think about what you think that reserve should be going forward. Steve, anything here?
No, I think the only thing I would say is, people ask, why would anyone adopt before they have to? What are a specific reason why you might consider formally adopting Cecil before the beginning of next year? And it's really, the situation that we've seen a couple times with some credit unions is just if their examiner has some issues with their if you're currently having a disagreement with your examiners about your reserve levels and they think it needs to be higher, particularly the way it ends up, and you've done some Cecil calculations and feel that you actually might need a lower reserve under a Cecil methodology. Instead of continuing to fight the good fight with your examiners based on an old methodology that will be defunct at the end of a year, it's an opportunity potentially to say, hey, you know what, we're going to go ahead and adopt Cecil early. We're going to restart that conversation that with our examiner using a methodology that we believe might lead to a possibly a smaller reserve. So it's a very specific kind of scenario, but it's one that we have seen. And creating multiple scenarios, like Sean said, you can almost stress it if you want to by picking different look back periods. But in general, creating a few different scenarios and even sharing with your examiner this year before Cecil is the law of the land, we're at a unique point in time where you can present scenarios to your examiners and talk about them where the results you're not on the hook for yet, right? So you could create a more optimistic Q factor scenario and a more pessimistic one and create a range of reserves that could all be appropriate using the warm method under Cecil. Even if that's a range you can drive a truck through at this point, it'll give you, hopefully you share that with your examiner and then you wait for some feedback. And if they give you some, that helps you design your future scenarios, knowing that, you can do the numbers any way you want, but if they expect you to kind of end up at A or B at the end of all this, you kind of want to know where A or B are. So, presenting them with good data and multiple scenarios gives them a chance to give you some feedback now before, before you're beholden to it. And it'll help you design future scenarios and get off on a better foot, have better footing for next year.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Question came in. If you run quarterly, is running a month in arrears appropriate? Call report update timelines will naturally run at a delay. So my response to this is, again, we do give you the ability to update your loan balances on our tool. But if we're talking about the historical losses, right, it's not going to change that much dramatically. If it is, or if there's something that's really impactful that changed in a month, you're probably addressing that in a Q factor, right? If there's something that's seriously going to change within a month, that's going to be more addressed in a Q factor adjustment rather than whether the data is a month in arrears. So I think it's more than appropriate to run quarterly. I think it's more than appropriate to use the historical call report the way we do, because again, anything that's going to happen within that period of time isn't going to show up in those historical numbers. It's going to show up in a Q factor.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, Sean. So what I would say to answer the question, yes. Running it quarterly, having this 1 month delay, people say, when they're looking at the tool, well, it's the end, it's February. I want to run this with current balances as of the end of January, but there's this gap where we have a 10-year historical record for me and my peers, but that all ended on December 31st. Well, anything that's happened in the last 30 days is by definition, Q factors are for current or future conditions. Something that's happened in the last 30 days is what I would define as a current condition, right? So you have your long-term lifetime historical rates. And then if you have a Q factor from the last, you can add a custom Q factor column, say changes in the last month, current trends evolving, whatever you want to call it, and then make an adjustment if you've seen something inside your four walls or in your local market in the last month. But the historical starting point is lifetime 10 years worth of data. One additional month is not going to move the needle. And then you can adjust with Q factors. So yeah, I think that's a more than appropriate way to tackle it.
And I think really kind of illustrates why the incurred loss model moved to the Cecil calculation, right? It's because it's that very fact. Something may have changed in the last 30 days. And in the old methodology, you would not have been able to reserve for that potentially because the loss wasn't there. If something's going to clearly impact your portfolio that's occurred in the last 30 days, that's the forward, as Steve said, that's the current and forward assessment that you're going to incorporate this to adjust your reserve. So good question, though. That's actually a very good question. All right, so let's keep moving on here. Again, we wanted to touch on that while Cecil is different, it doesn't have to be transformatively different. And we felt like there was a lot of similarities with the way we tackled it with the portfolio solution and the warm and what you've been doing in the incurred loss methodology. We didn't want to minimize that, but still point out the differences. So we just want to touch on a few of those this morning. Steve, you want to take these?
Yeah, and we've already sort of brought up a lot of in our discussion today so far that Cecil presents a longer term, more cyclical approach, right? Again, instead of looking at losses in any one given year or annualized period, we're estimating lifetime losses, and we're going further back into the past to see what our lifetime losses or life of loan losses have been historically, to then try to project into the future. And as we just finished talking about, Cecil is a little bit more pro-cyclical, a little bit more forward-looking. So we're not waiting until it is probable that a loss has been incurred in order to integrate that assessment into our reserve calculations. One thing that's certainly different on its surface, but not necessarily as different as it might seem, a lot of us seems to be following that train of thought, is the old concept of the FAS 5 versus the FAS 114, right? Our general versus our specific reserve. And when something needs to go from a FAS 5 to a FAS 114, when it meets the old concept of impairment, that goes away. So at least from the old concept of impairment ceases to exist. The old standard of FAS 5 and FAS 114 are completely replaced by the Cecil standard, but does that in favor of the pools. However, does that mean that we necessarily never need to individually assess a loan for a reserve calculation? No, it does not. So FASB kind of confused everybody a little bit by saying those go away. And then as soon as people started kind of asking questions, it seems like they're starting to come back in a relatively, in a similar, not identical, but similar way. And that's true because FASB then goes on to say, however, if there are loans in your portfolio that exhibit very unique risk characteristics and can't reasonably be pooled with any other loans, then they need to be culled from the herd and assessed individually. And so everyone then sort of naturally asks the follow-up question. So FAS 114 is exactly the way it was before. It's still there. Yes, the concept of individual assessments comes back under Cecil. No, it's not the same standard or threshold as 114 or the old impairment would be. And when do I need to take
Hey, Steve, you're
the loan and individually assess it and take it out of the pool? Go ahead,
Steve.
John.
Yeah, you were cutting out
Yes.
there. You rephrase what you just said.
All right. I'm not sure when I cut out, but we still need to manage individual assessments under Cecil. It's just the threshold for when they need to be individually assessed has not been well established by Cecil as of by FASB as of this point. So it is right now we're left to our own devices, and it's relatively subjective when we need to individually manage them versus when they can stay part of the pooled portfolio. Our tool has allows you to do it either way. Another way that they're it doesn't have to be that different from what you've been doing in the past. Factors, right? Qualitative factors as a concept is not new. We've been dealing with qualitative factors, especially from an internal standpoint in the incurred loss methodology, right? Where we look at our internal data, like risk grades and whatnot, non-public information about our loans and our portfolio to get a fee.
Okay, I think Steve's having some audio difficulties here, so I'll just pick up on it. So again, Q factors, again, they're not a new concept. I think you've done good work. We've built a process that's comfortable with you, your regulators, your board, your auditors. So we think you should continue to incorporate those. And I think what Cecil asked, kind of on the dovetailing on that last question, right, is adding that current and more importantly, economic, or not, excuse me, just that forward-looking forecast is really the thing that's going to change the way we've done the process now. But I think the other point Steve was trying to make is that for all of the attempts to try to make these processes as objective as we possibly can, at the end of the day, it still comes down to a subjective thing with the Q factors. And that's just simply not going away. And that's something that, again, is going to be built over time and is already built over time with your regulators and your credit union. So, again, I don't think we want to downplay that, how important it is, and why we think it's important to begin running that parallel process this year to make sure everybody's in sync before we get to the transition period. Because quite candidly, right, we have credit unions who in some ways are probably over-reserved, and then I think we've certainly seen credit unions who are potentially under-reserved, right? And some of the credit unions are concerned about that, but then there are others who've said, we've already talked with our regulator about it and they're okay with it. So, we can't see into that relationship, but clearly, longevity and experience and, with your regulator is certainly gonna potentially impact, where they land you, in this process.
Sorry about that, John. I should be back and stable now.
All right, good. All right, so we've already had a number of questions. Just a reminder, if you want to, submit a Q&A or a chat, just let us know. Here's another question that's come in. If we choose to view quarterly, when does call report data get input into the model? Steve?
Yep. So we've worked long and hard with the Ncua to improve that process. Historically, the Ncua has been, I know this is probably shocking to hear, taken a little while to get us make some of that data available on the industry after the end of each quarter. But we worked hard with them, and we have a much better connection with their data now. So as people file and refile call reports, if you refile old ones, we pick those up on a daily basis. As far as when you can run the entire tool with the next quarter's data, not just with your historical data, but also all your peer data updated, pretty much at the end of that month, right? So all the call reports for 12/31 are due at the end by just before the end of January. So within a couple days of all those call reports being due, the entire system will have 12/31 or fourth quarter available for the peer data and for your historical data. So yeah, it's pretty much the 1 month after the end of the quarter, the entire universe is populated with the next quarter's data. And but of course, you can always go in and update your current balances as of any point in time. And so it doesn't limit you to running it quarterly. You can still run it intra-quarterly. But in a perfect scenario, end of the first month, you can do it on an apples to apples basis with all the new historical.
Yeah, just to kind of rephrase, right? So our objective is, provided everything gets filed properly, is that first or second business day after the filing period, we will have all that data updated. But as Steve pointed out, you can always update your current loan balances for your most recent numbers. So if you have questions about that, we can walk you through that, but that will get you there. All right, so we've already, kind of covered this one. We've gotten a number of questions, so we thank you all very much for that today. That's been fantastic. That's really what we really want to drive, and really the inspiration for these coffee talks is to make it very interactive and very two-way the conversation. So thank you all for your input today. I hope it was helpful for you. Just a couple of final things. I know we're getting close here on time. We do have other resources available to you that we want to continue to not only provide with you just information about the Cecil solver in particular, but just kind of the history and the narrative of what's happened with Cecil, not only for the Ncua and what they've put out there, but also the other regulators. Again, the Ncua was purposely quiet because of the efforts they were trying to make, or the Ncua and the other trade associations to try to get the Cecil standard removed for credit unions. Again, they didn't want to be putting out information if they were fighting to get it done. So now that that is clear that that's not going to happen, I think we'll probably hear more from them this year. But that's why you'll see a lot of our resources are dedicated toward the bank side because of the efforts the Ncua was mounting to try to have this not apply. But the very smallest of credit unions, it's gonna take effect. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Nope. So for if anyone who doesn't know this, it was right there in the regulatory and industry accounting resources. That first one is the Ncua Cecil transition rules. That's something that a document that they published in June or July of this past year. It's a very long, very dry type document, but it kind of, from my perspective, was sort of the official capitulation that this was going to happen, and it was going to happen on this timeline, and it was going to apply to credit unions just like commercial banks and everybody else. It did put in the one small carve out. So for the smallest credit unions, anyone who is under $10 million in total assets will not necessarily have to use Cecil. The way they carved that out was simply in saying that if you have less than 10 million in total assets, your loan loss reserve calculation will no longer need to meet GAAP standards from the Ncua's perspective. And so that's how they were able to carve out the smallest institutions. Now, there are some credit unions under 10 million in assets who are actually using our tool anyway, because they think it's an easier, better way of doing their reserve than what they've been doing in the past. So it doesn't mean you can't use Cecil, and it still might make sense. It just means that for the absolute smallest guys, you don't have to. But for everybody else, that's the scoop. There's not going to be a carve out or an exemption.
Thanks, Steve. And so again, we put those there for your reference. You can feel fortunate if you ever want to know somebody who reads those rules. Steve Huntington's your man. He's read them. So, but we do have them out there for you, just in case you are curious and want to take a look at any of those documents. So those are all links you can access on our website. All right. So, moving forward, again, we are here to help you, and we are going to continue to do that either on a one-on-one basis or through these monthly coffee talks. So our next one is scheduled for February 18th. If you want to see a more in-depth discussion around the Cecil solver tool in particular, Steve will be doing a webinar on the 25th where he'll actually kind of walk you through the tool and get much more granular on how the tool works. You can also always schedule a demo with us where you can see your data, as that's often insightful. It kind of helps bring everything to life and maybe makes it more understandable if you can see your own data in the tool. You can always email us or schedule that with David and Jason from our team, and we will take you through your information. But again, if you want to register for the webinar on Tuesday, Steve will take you and Jason will take you through our tool in great detail. And again, hopefully, illustrate to you how we help and have already helped hundreds of credit unions, address Cecil as we move forward. Okay, so I think, let me see if there's any other questions. I don't see any. On behalf of Steve and myself and all of us here at Quick Rate, I couldn't thank you all enough for attending. Thank you for the great input, the questions. It's exactly what we want. We will work to continue to bring you a industry, other experts here throughout the year, and continue to provide as much information. Our goal is your goal. We want to make this a smooth transition for you. So we're going to be here to assist however we can. So again, thank you all very much for the time. And we will look forward to seeing you or hearing from you in the next couple of weeks or next month. And if anything comes up in the interim, just email us or call us, and we'll jump on a Zoom or a GoToMeeting and try to address whatever issues you might be having. So again, thank you very much for attending. Have a great weekend. Be safe, and thank you again. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.